So, something quite revealing is unfolding inside the Kremlin, as Putin is increasingly enraged about Europe, of all places. And the insults, the statements he makes, are a dead giveaway. You see, Vladimir Putin isn't just mouthing off, he's lashing out. And that matters because leaders of his stature, mindset, don't do this if they're in control and content with the situation. They do so when something is starting to slip. In the past week alone, Putin has made comments around Europe's annoyance and publicly mocked leaders as little pigs, accusing them of plotting Russia's collapse and openly warning that if Europe blocks any peace talks, Russia will simply take more land in Ukraine through coercion. Now, on the surface, you may just shrug and say classic Kremlin rhetoric, but that misses the point, as this isn't about strength, it's about frustration and Putin's growing reaction to not Ukraine or Washington, but to Europe. Indeed, a continent, a group of players that he's always considered largely irrelevant in the grander scheme of things, are in his spotlight, and his latest attacks reveal what is really changing in his calculus, and how Europe can increasingly get under the skin of Moscow, but also the United States. All of that I want to explore in this video, and how it plays out as we go into 2026.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, where if you're new here, we look at the intersection of geopolitics, international relations, and economic statecraft, with a particular emphasis on the Russia-Ukraine war. Not just what's happening, but why it is happening, and what it means when the headlines suddenly refocus on something else. We're dealing with something that looks rather cosmetic on the face of it, insults, rhetoric, posturing, but actually cuts to the heart of Europe's role in this war and Putin's mindset. Because when Putin does this, it usually tells us more about his confidence, or their lack of, and about what he's worried about losing. Now, as always, let me know in the comments what you think about this. I am not going to get ahead of myself and pretending that this is the be-all and end-all. We have a long way to go, and of course, the situation for Ukraine is always precarious. And the imminent collapse of Russia is not on the horizon, but it is certainly going in the direction of things getting worse. I like to tell things as they are, regardless of how I prefer them to be, and I want to be reassuring, but also pragmatic in how we do that. So let me know in the comments below what you think about this in the bigger picture. Thanks. Now, precisely on the bigger picture, here it is. At the same time that Trump's America is signaling this flexibility, ambiguity, and a willingness to accommodate Moscow ever more than it was even, say, a few weeks ago, Europe is doing its own thing. It's doing the opposite. It's locking down these Russian assets, it's talking seriously about the long-term funding for Ukraine, and it's starting, albeit very late, but very visibly now, to behave like an independent strategic actor rather than a passive one. And this shift really matters because it directly threatens one of Russia's last remaining sources of leverage. And once you see that, Putin's sudden anger, contempt for Europe, in ways that we haven't seen for much of this war, really start to make sense. Now, to be clear, Putin's outburst didn't come out of nowhere. It comes as European leaders are meeting to lock in long-term funding for Ukraine. As Brussels has moved to indefinitely immobilize Russian sovereign assets, this is causing uproar amongst Russian elites. And is the idea of using the interest or even the principle of those assets stopped being theoretical and started being a political reality, well, Russia's suddenly running to the courts, something that it wouldn't normally pay much attention to. For Moscow, this is a red line, another one. Those frozen assets, around 200 billion euros, aren't just money. They are leverage, as I've said in previous videos. They are the assumption that sooner or later, Europe would blink, that fatigue would set in, that negotiations would just return the cash. And so Europe is sending a very different message, and pretty quickly, that this money isn't going to be coming back by default, not without a settlement and not without conditions. That fundamentally changes the balance of power, and Putin knows it. Of course, it's not as simple as the Europeans being able to flip a switch or suddenly the assets are in the hands of Ukraine. But it does mean that the Russian polity has to refocus some of their energy and time onto something that they didn't really think they'd have to, nor want to. To understand why Putin reacts this way, you have to understand how he sees the world and how long he's been telling himself the same story. Putin is, above all, a storyteller. He constantly reaches back centuries, recasting these medieval dynasties, imperial board and Soviet decisions to argue that Ukraine is not and never was a sovereign state, a historical error seemingly waiting just to be corrected. We've seen this with his lecture towards Tucker Carlson for nearly 2 hours, which even made Carlson bewildered and wonder, what is the point of talking to this guy if he's not going to actually answer my questions or just make any coherent sense? Putin laid out that fantastical narrative about Kiev and Rus and how it's proof of Russian entitlement. Reports suggesting that when he repeated this performance privately to Donald Trump last year, Trump was so bored that he literally just asked Putin to skip it, which is why their meeting was actually much shorter. But this boredom also misses the point. This isn't about persuasion, it's about the justification. Putin selectively rewriting the biographies of Cossacks, Katerina or Catherine the Great, even Lenin, and all to produce a usable myth, one that allows Moscow to identify borders that need correcting and Russian speakers who supposedly need defending. That's the first pillar. The second is, of course, weaponized victimhood. In Kremlin narratives, NATO enlargement becomes a humiliation on the scale of Versailles. Russia lost the Cold War, was weakened in the 90s, and only in Putin's return or emergence, and as he tells it, the West exploited that weakness rather than integrating Russia as an equal, even though in the early days, NATO was more than willing to do that. Promises supposedly made to Mikhail Gorbachev are endlessly recycled, despite never being formalized to claim deception and dishonor. And so by this logic, Russia isn't expanding, it's restoring its dignity. The third pillar of this is inevitability. In the eyes of the Kremlin, if the West refuses to accept Russia's security demands, conflict becomes unavoidable and therefore justified. Aggression becomes defense, conquest becomes necessity. Together, these ideas form a doctrine, and doctrines matter because they make behavior predictable. They define the principles by which Putin conducts this war of his, a war of conquest, a war of conquer in Ukraine. So when Putin calls European leaders little pigs, this isn't necessarily a slip, although in some ways it is. On the one hand, it is deliberate. He's framing Europe not as an independent actor, but as a greedy, historical, and manipulated by Washington. In his telling, Europe didn't support Ukraine out of principle, but out of spite, a desire to weaken Moscow and settle old scores. But on the other hand, it does represent a minor slip because it demonstrates that he has to pay attention to an entity, a group, a bloc, who he has never really wanted to, especially in the context of a war as scaled as the one he is currently fighting. But the framing also serves two other purposes. Firstly, it delegitimizes Europe as a negotiating partner. Second, it reframes the conflict, not as Russia invading Ukraine, but as Europe refusing to accept Russia's demands. Notice how Putin always claims he is open to dialogue, but only once Europe changes course, only once it replaces leaders, only once it accepts Moscow's version of reality. That isn't diplomacy, of course not. It's conditional surrender. The latest emphasis on that he will continue to take land all the way towards parts of southern and central Ukraine demonstrate what he's really about. Simultaneously, Putin did escalate further. He warned that if Ukraine and Europe refuse to engage with US-led peace proposals, Russia will simply take this territory. This threat is not really aimed at Kiev. It's squared firmly at Europe. Ukraine already understands the stakes. It's been doing the defending on behalf of Europe for ages. And the European audience that matters is still, needs persuading. Russia currently controls the same 20% of Ukrainian territory, but Moscow insists that these areas are going to be expanded on and all permanently under Moscow control. Ukraine rejects that, and so does every other country that is in Europe. But Putin is signaling something else, that time favors Russia, that patience favors Moscow, that Europe will eventually tire. And he backs that message with numbers. Russia spends 7% of its GDP on this war. Its defense ministry says the task for 26 is to increase the pace of their operations. We cover extensively the cost of what this means for Europe, Russia in the longer term. And it's no longer framed as an emergency. It's framed as a permanent condition. The problem is, of course, on the other hand, is that this doesn't have any trickle-down benefit for the Russian economy. It doesn't benefit other industries. Relatively destructive. The things that you're producing are destroyed on the battlefield. Well, that is a problem. For Europe, for years, it has supported Ukraine, but without really agreeing on why. Was the objective Ukrainian victory, or was it to weaken Russia? Or was it simply preventing a wider war while managing the escalation for the greater protection of the continent? Was Ukraine a bit of a scapegoat? Because no shared answer has ever emerged, and support has been incremental, cautious, and inconsistent. And that lack of cohesion is one of the biggest impacts, and why Putin has never really taken Europe seriously. Europe has remained reduced, but in significant importer of Russian gas. It has debated endlessly over whether frozen assets of Russia should be used and how. And it has avoided articulating a clear end of state for the war. But that ambiguity is starting to erode. Senior European individuals remark probably that the EU could fund Ukraine's defense with around 100 billion a year for several years without serious economic strain. If that's even partially true, then Europe's restraint has been political, not ever material, and I think that's pretty evident. And now, for the first time, Moscow is beginning to see what this means if the political and economic aspects can align. The frozen assets are just the tip of the iceberg, and long-term funding is being discussed openly. And the idea that Europe might anchor negotiations rather than beg to join them is no longer unthinkable. That shift is exactly what Putin is reacting to and what he doesn't want. So we talk about this a lot on the channel right now. What does it mean? Well, without a doctrine, Europe reacts, and reaction is exactly what creates opportunity. NATO officials are now openly warning that Russia could be capable of testing the alliance within 5 years, or even less. Not with a full-scale invasion, but with something far more calculated. Something known as the Suwalki Gap, this narrow corridor between Belarus and Kaliningrad. A hybrid escalation designed to test NATO's will, not its firepower. Russia's very crafty at being able to find ways to pressure, the right pressure points, decisive points of a military line. And it just needs to fracture it politically. A short, sharp shock, even a limited one, could expose divisions, delay responses, and erode any credibility. And that risk grows as Europe rearms slowly, and Washington signals not just fatigue, but a larger withdrawal. Look at history, it gives us a warning. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine gave the West clarity. Defending democratic societies was a shared interest. Nothing has replaced it. And in that vacuum, though, Russia now keeps probing. In my mind, it's a case of time, as always. Europe has the capacity to do this, and if it can continue to build on the steps that we're currently seeing, then that is something that's going to frustrate not just the Kremlin, but all the anti-European voices, the Vances, those that just want to see the continent fail, which I don't believe it is going to. I'm very cautious about the extent to which unity can occur, but if they can find ways to sidestep the dissenting voices, the Hungarys, the Orban types, then I believe Europe can effectively and relatively coherently move forward. It's that Europe remains strategically ambiguous long enough for Moscow to keep testing. That is the biggest problem here. If Europe doesn't decide what it's willing to defend, how it's going to, over what time scale, then Putin will decide for it. And that's what we must ensure doesn't happen. But that's it from me. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this. It's a little bit more of a raw take. Some of my musings that have come to mind over the past few days, reading and observing developments in their latest round. And if you don't know me, my name is Pyotr Kurzin. I am half English, half Russian, wanting to see Europe succeed and ensure that the future of democracy and rule of law and freedom of expression, determined by us, not by strong men like Putin, continues to push forward. And if you want to support me further, then do give the video a like, subscribe for more videos like this, and you can find links in the description to buy me a coffee or become a member. We'll see you on the next one. Take care.